Good evening. How are y'all doing tonight? Whew, that's what I can say. It's kind of been one of those weeks, I feel like. Oh, wait a minute. It's only Monday. But that's okay. That's kind of how it's supposed to, I think, be on maybe Monday. It's time to just go ahead, and we got things to do, people to see, and places to go. And that's how it is. Life is good. That's what I can say. Is we had an amazing service yesterday. I am excited about where God is taking us. And that's what I can say. Today was a day that it was sunny and nice outside. And see, I stayed inside and studied today. That was kind of my plan for my day, was to do that. And so I did. I got to stay home and just study. And that was a good thing. You know, I wanted to remind us, and I know that I read this some time ago. I don't know when. And I wanted to remind us again when I came across this quote or this saying, that we don't begin or end our prayers. Our words simply leap for a few moments into the ongoing conversation between Jesus and the Spirit within us. You know what that really says? Is that you and I are in constant conversation with this God of creation. He never leaves us. He doesn't walk away from us. He doesn't turn his back, and neither do we. And I just, when I looked at the front of my Bible and that was stuck in there, I thought, you know, it is so true. Sometimes in this world that is so chaotic, we think we have to stop. Well, I'm not sure we do, because life goes on. Life is on a journey. And I kind of feel like that's the journey that maybe through Genesis and even Revelation that we're taking. And the journey we take on Sunday mornings when we interface with God in a different way, in a different setting, in a different space. And so tonight, we begin. Well, we begin lifting our hands and our faces and our eyes to the sky and say, thank you, God. Thank you, God, for all that you've given us. Thank you, God, for you are good, even in the midst of troubles and hardships and questions that we shake our head and go, it shouldn't be, but it is. Tonight, let's open up our Bibles. You're going to hear what I just did in a minute. Oh, I want to write myself a note, though, because, okay, I got to write myself a note. Okay, so, chapter 47, and people wonder how come I don't get very far, because I have to stop and think about where I'm at the moment sometimes. Anyway, chapter 47 in Genesis, and we are on verse 13. Okay, now remember what's going on here. Remember that Joseph is now settled with his brothers, and they have gotten the permission from Pharaoh to stay in the land that in Goshen, which is where Joseph wanted them to be able to stay. It's the most fertile land. It was the land that had the abundance. And there would be many of them who were in coming into that space. And so that was the land that Joseph really wanted to provide the best. Okay, but remember, this is famine time. And we're still in the midst of that famine. It has not ended at all. We're just going along. Okay, so, verse 13, we better start reading. But bread, there was none in all the land. So, everything up until then, and that had been consumed in the 2 years. Okay, we're about 2 years in. So, in 2 years, everything had been consumed. For the famine was exceedingly heavy. So, it was extremely severe and extremely hard at this point, because there was no bread that had been already made and put away. and the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were exhausted by the famine. It was not just food, but spirit had been depleted. Their food was gone, but they were also aching spiritually. They were dying. And so everything, and I know in times in our lives spiritually, we become depleted. We become worn out. It becomes very hard for life to continue, but we have to. Okay, so verse 14. Joseph had collected all the silver that was to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan from the rations that they had bought. Okay, so this was the silver was being exchanged for food now. It wasn't the coinage anymore. Okay, this was now a time that they had been exchanging silver for their food. Okay, and Joseph, though, had brought the silver into Pharaoh's house. So everything was taken to Pharaoh at this point. Verse 15. When the silver in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan had run out, it had all been spent in years 3 to 5 of the famine. They were now going to have to use a barter system. They were going to start having to barter for food. And all the Egyptians came to Joseph saying, "Come now, let us have bread." Like, what are we supposed to do now? We're in trouble. Have you stopped to think about us now? Why should we die in front of you because the silver is gone? Okay, one thing on these verses for 13 to 24. When the families had exhausted their Egyptian money, they started giving animals in exchange for the grain. And after the animals are gone, the land was being given, and a national income tax of 20% was being taxed onto what was going on. But God prescribed the tithes for Israel. And so that was different than what that 20% that the Egyptians were having to pay. So understand there's a progression here as we're going through the famine of what they could do. So they had started out using their coinage. They've now had silver. We are now going to have to move on into animals being bartered in for grain. Now remember, there's still grain. There's just not the prepared bread, the prepared food kind of thing. Okay, so verse 16, we're going to get the animal exchange for this next year, which is really year 7. We're going to read a second year, but I think we are really in the 6th and 7th years of the famine at this point. So in verse 16, Joseph said, "Come now, let me have your livestock, and I will give you bread, grain, for your livestock, since the silver is gone." Joseph is very understanding to what's happening. He also does not want bad and evil to happen to his people. He is concerned. He's a very wise man. He has thought this through. He didn't come into this not having a clue. So, I will give you bread or grain for your livestock if you exchange your livestock. Verse 17, so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread, grain, okay, in exchange for the horses, the sheep, livestock, the oxen, livestock, and their asses. He got them through with bread, well, the grain, in exchange for all their livestock in that year. There would have been, you have to remember, this was also, if there's famine, there was drought. So there was little grass for the cattle and the animals to eat. This was drought time. They couldn't afford to keep those animals because most of the animals probably, there was no water for them. There was no grass. They would die anyway. And so we've got a little bartering going on. And my guess is we're using those animals also to help feed the people in what could be purchased back and forth. Okay, so verse 18. But when that year had run out, and they came back to him in the second year. Okay, here the second year is the 7th year of the famine, the second year of the animal exchange, the bartering going on. This is the time, the second year of that. Okay, so don't get confused. We're now in the 7th year of the famine. And they said to him, we cannot hide from my Lord, that if the silver is run out and the animals and stocks are the Lord's, nothing remains for my Lord except for our bodies and our soil. Now they come and say, all we have is our land and ourselves. What else? We have nothing. We've given you everything we have, but we want to continue to live. How are you going to help us in doing this? Verse 19. Why should we die before your eyes? So our soil. See, their land is also dying. It's not just them. But their land is not being able to be used because of the massive drought. The land is having to stay idle. Drought land does no good if it's not being farmed. Acquire us and our soul for bread. We will sell ourselves, in other words, to you, so that we can have bread, so we can have grain, so we can make bread. Give us what we need. And we and our soil, we become servants to Pharaoh. They were willing to give up everything, and they were pledging themselves to become servants of Pharaoh. They wanted food so badly. They wanted work so that they could pay for what they were given. They didn't want to hand out, irony. They didn't want something just handed to them. They wanted to work for it. They wanted to work for their food. No handouts here. That's not what they were asking for. I don't write that. That's a great analogy. No handouts. Okay. So give us seed for sowing, that we may live and not die, and that the soil may not become desolate. So they also wanted not just bread for themselves or grain so that they could make bread, but they wanted seed, that they could seed their farms and have then and regain. But in the midst of a drought, I'm not sure that getting the seed for the ground was going to do much good at that point. What we have to remember in this section that we're reading now is that Joseph's stature is really a rescuer. And he's a rescuer not only of his family, but all of Egypt. His position is being elevated. His power is complete. There is nothing more. His brothers were ready to become the Lord's servants. And so now are the Egyptians. Now, which Lord? Well, I think we're going to see that. We're going to see which Lord, which one, big L or little l, servants are they becoming? Okay, verse 20. So Joseph acquired all the soil of Egypt for Pharaoh. For each of the Egyptians sold his field for the famine that was strong upon them. They sold their land, their house. They sold everything they had, that they could have food. They wanted to work. and all the land went over to Pharaoh. Now, what are they going to do? Do they move? Well, we're going to find out. In verse 21, as for the people, he transferred them into the cities from one edge of Egypt's border to its other edge. Okay, so it looks like that Pharaoh is now moving all the people, moving them into the cities where there could be larger masses of people. He was trying to preserve their lives. And Pharaoh and Joseph had thought this through. He wanted them closer together instead far apart, that there could be a division of food, a division of items that they had. It was to protect the Israelites as well. They wanted to control what was happening, good or bad. Whether we want to say controlling the food source is a good thing, in the midst of a famine, in the midst of national calamity, is it better to bring people together that they may help each other in families? Or is it better to leave them all scattered out where there's so much time and animals can't go between to bring food back and forth? The land was now going to have to be used. They would have to pay rent to live on that land and use it. Was it right? We could probably argue and debate that. But I don't think Pharaoh was out for. I think Pharaoh was out to protect the people. And he saw the easiest way to get food back and forth as they could create it, as it could be made, to have people close. Interesting though, verse 22. Only the soil of the priests he did not acquire, for the priests had a prescribed allocation from Pharaoh. So they already had an arrangement, the priests did, with Pharaoh, and their land was not taken from them during this time. There is something godly, I think, for Pharaoh going on. There is something about respecting the priests. He did not demand they give up everything. And they ate from their allocation which Pharaoh had given them. Therefore, they did not sell their soil. See, theirs was sacred. The priests didn't have much anyway. They didn't lose their land because they already had a ration, a portion, a small piece. And so they were able to keep that. They would not be able to get any more, though, and they weren't going to town to get their rations or their food supply. They were having to make do with what they had in their possession. Think about that. They had to make do with that. But the priests, the godly ones, did not have to sell. Verse 23. Joseph said to the people, now that I have acquired you and your soil today for Pharaoh, here you have seed, sow the soil. See, Joseph could speak to the situation. For those who did stay on the land, because it was now Pharaoh's, they could sow. So there would have been some who would have stayed out. Okay, it doesn't say everyone had to come in, but he transferred people. My guess is those who were not productive, however that was gauged. But if you could, and since the land was now Pharaoh's, you were basically doing a renting the land, and and whatever was produced, we're going to hear that in a minute, a portion of that is Pharaoh's. For you now rent the land and you're working it for Pharaoh. But I'm guessing this was probably the end of large farms. Or maybe this is the beginning of large farms. I don't know. It depends on which way you want to look at it. And I'm not sure what a large farm in biblical times would have looked like. It would not have been as ours are today. So, verse 24. But it shall be at the ingatherings that you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh. So when the land does start to produce, 1/5 of what you have comes to Pharaoh. So this is the first example of sharecropping in the Bible. Pharaoh furnished the land and seed, and returned to him was 1/5 of the profits. The people got to keep 4/5 of the crop, and the people were thankful for anything. Just as Jesus did for you and me. See, he paid the price for you and me that the Egyptians are now having to pay to Pharaoh in many ways. Verse 24. The 4 other parts being for you, as seed for the field, and for your eating needs, and for those in your households, and for feeding your little ones. So it was the seed that was remaining after the crop yielded was to plant, to eat, for the servants, and for your children. It's very well split out why there are 4 parts to be done. Now, verses 25 and 26. Joseph, though, did not enrich himself as this was happening during the famine. There was no enrichment happening for Joseph. So verse 25, they said, you have saved our lives. He preserved them from famine. May we find favor in my Lord's eyes. We will become servants to Pharaoh. See, the Egyptians wanted to continue because they were so grateful that they had been given a chance to live. They had been given a chance for life, and life unending, even through the hardships of famine and drought. There was still an opportunity for them, but they wanted to work for it. No handouts allowed here. Verse 26. And Joseph made it a prescribed law until this day. So basically, it became law in their constitution concerning the soil of Egypt. For Pharaoh, every 5th part, all that Egypt produced, 1/5 would go to Pharaoh. Only the soil of the priests, that alone did not go over to Pharaoh. So in their constitution, a legally binding document, 1/5 goes to Pharaoh. The first taxation, maybe, we might say, went to the governing body. Now, what we know is that the priests were free from the taxes because they were to be given honor and authority. So the priests did not have to comply with that. In some ways, a little way, very marginal. In our culture today, we find that same thing. There are some tax breaks or some places that for clergy, we are, our taxes are a little different. I don't pay mine just the same way. There are some things I can claim to reduce and that kind of thing. Therefore, it's maybe kind of that kind of thing. Because of the respect, I'm not sure that that respect and honor and authority is there for today, but it was in biblical times anyway. Verse 27. Now Israel stayed in the land of Egypt in the region of Goshen. For 17 years now, Israel will stay in Goshen. He will watch it grow and multiply. He will see glimpses of God's promise to Abraham and what Israel will become. The riches and the numbers will grow while they are there. They obtained holdings in it, bore fruit, and became exceedingly many. And they also rented from Pharaoh. And they were not exempted just because they were Joseph's family. They had to rent the land in Goshen as well.